One question remains. Will Estella's new chance at life be enough to heal the wounds of years spent invisible? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Washington, D.C. pulsed like a wounded machine that night, 10:45 p.m., and the marble skeleton of the Capitol still glowed under sterile white floodlights. Inside, hours earlier, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett had delivered a blistering argument against the systemic abuse of part-time workers, a hearing where CEOs shifted blame and senators stared at their watches. Now her heels clicked with purpose across cracked pavement as she crossed Constitution Avenue alone, the chill biting through her coat. Hunger gnawed at her, but it wasn't just for food, it was for clarity. She stepped into a dimly lit 24-hour convenience store, fluorescent lights humming like a dying confession booth. The air smelled of old coffee and antiseptic, and that's when she saw her. A janitor in her 60s, bones visible under a baggy uniform, hunched over a mop like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Her eyes didn't just look tired, they looked resigned. Jasmine froze mid-step, her political instincts prickling. The woman moved with such fragile deliberation, cradling a small plastic grocery bag like it held the last chance for dignity. As the woman shuffled past the automatic doors and disappeared into the fogged-up darkness, something inside Jasmine snapped. A thread pulled too tight for too long. She stepped forward to pay for her snack, but stopped short, gripping the counter, her mind elsewhere. That woman didn't just look poor, she looked invisible, erased in plain sight. Jasmine had just spent 10 hours fighting on paper for people like her, only to walk into a living reminder that the system didn't care. No security escort, no Uber waiting, no rest after back-breaking labor, just a bag of marked-down groceries and a long walk into oblivion. Every second the door creaked open for a new customer, none of whom even glanced in the woman's direction. Jasmine glanced out the window. The figure was almost gone now, swallowed by the night. And then, as if pulled by something ancient and unrelenting, Jasmine Crockett made a decision. She would follow, not as a congresswoman, not as a hero, but as a witness, because tonight the city's silence was no longer acceptable. And just like that, the woman who had spent the entire day confronting injustice in a marble chamber of power was now staring into the very face of it. Raw, quiet, and walking away into the cold without anyone noticing. Jasmine stood at the edge of the sidewalk like she was at the edge of a cliff. Behind her, the hum of neon lights and sliding doors faded into irrelevance. Ahead, the janitor's frail silhouette wavered beneath the stuttering orange of a dying street lamp, shrinking with every uneven step into the night. For a fleeting second, Jasmine thought of turning around, returning to her car, and resuming the comforts of being needed, respected, heard. But that moment dissolved the instant she looked again. The old woman wasn't just tired, she was discarded, as if her usefulness had been wrung out of her bones, and she was now walking herself to wherever forgotten people go. No bus route, no security escort, no coat thick enough to fight off the city's cold indifference. Just a plastic bag gripped like a lifeline, and a spine bent under the invisible weight of a nation's neglect. Jasmine's chest tightened. This wasn't policy anymore. This was proof. She stepped off the concrete ledge like she was crossing a boundary she could never uncross. Her car keys stayed buried in her coat pocket, untouched. She didn't want glass between them. She needed to feel this. She unwrapped her scarf, stuffed it into her bag, and adjusted the collar of her coat like a soldier readying for battle. Her heels, which had clicked confidently through congressional halls just hours before, now moved in near silence, each footstep deliberate, careful not to draw attention. The distance between her and the woman grew thinner with every block, but Jasmine kept back, never too close, always watching. The city around them was slowly decaying into shadows. Fast food wrappers in the gutters, graffiti bleeding down brick walls, windows glowing dimly with lives too tired to stay lit. Every step Jasmine took wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. She was descending from power into a kind of truth no bill on the Senate floor had ever truly captured. And for the first time all day, she wasn't speaking. She was listening, Not with her ears, but with her eyes, her skin, and the cold that now cut straight to the bone. This wasn't curiosity anymore. It was confrontation. Every step Jasmine took behind that frail figure was a descent into a side of the city that policy never touched and privilege refused to acknowledge. The woman walked with a strange kind of rhythm, slow, steady, and heartbreakingly rehearsed, like someone who had made the same journey through darkness too many times to count. She didn't look around. She didn't check her phone. She didn't hesitate at corners like someone waiting for a ride. She just kept moving forward, her plastic bag swaying with each step like a pendulum of survival. Jasmine followed at a cautious distance, every muscle in her body alert, not because she feared danger, but because she could feel it in the air. This wasn't a neighborhood, it was a wound. They had left behind the glossed-over parts of D.C., the polished sidewalks, the freshly painted row houses, the echoes of late-night joggers and luxury sedans. Now the streets narrowed, their surfaces cracked and uneven, lined with rusted fences and garbage bins overflowing from neglect. Street lamps buzzed overhead, some burned out entirely, others casting pale amber circles like dying moons. The buildings loomed closer together, brick chipped and window frames splintered, like teeth worn down from grinding too long in silence. Jasmine's breath slowed as she took it all in. Not just the place, but what it meant. These weren't just forgotten streets. They were erased, cut out from every congressional blueprint and gentrification pitch deck she'd ever seen. And yet here was this woman, tiny and trembling, walking them like they were the only thing left that still made sense. Jasmine's shoes sank slightly into a patch of wet asphalt, and for a moment she had to stop, her chest tightening, not from exhaustion, but from rage. This woman had cleaned floors beneath chandeliers, stocked shelves for senators, and likely smiled at strangers who would never remember her name. And now, after all that labor, she was walking through neighborhoods where even hope had packed up and left. Jasmine had spent years writing legislation for working-class Americans, had stood on podiums demanding equity, but nothing had ever prepared her for this. The raw geography of failure, mapped out in boarded-up windows and broken street signs. There was no metaphor here. There was only truth, and that truth walked 10 feet ahead of her, underdressed and overlooked, with a plastic bag clutched like it carried everything she had left. She had chased shadows across crumbling sidewalks, thinking she understood hardship. But as the woman reached that steel door, Jasmine Crockett realized this was not just poverty. It was exile sealed in rust and silence. The lot was barren, the kind of dead space cities ignore, wedged between two collapsing buildings and littered with old tires, broken glass, and the skeletal remains of things no one cared to reclaim. At the far edge of that void stood a shipping container, hunched and weather-stained, its paint blistered like old wounds that never healed. It bore no sign of habitation, no welcome mat, no number, no protection from the night, just steel and resignation. A single wire dangled from a utility pole nearby, looping into the container like a lifeline that could snap at any moment. The woman approached it without pause, like someone returning to a sentence, not a sanctuary. Jasmine halted beside a rusted fence, keeping her breath quiet as the door creaked open. The sound was hollow, metallic, like a verdict being handed down in the dark. She inched forward, careful not to be seen, until her eyes aligned with a narrow split between two warped metal panels. Inside, the air looked heavy. The walls were lined with old blankets stapled to the interior like failed insulation, and on the bare cement floor, two small children lay huddled beneath a single fleece throw, thin, fraying, and barely covering their legs. One was already awake, eyes wide open but lifeless, staring at the door as if hoping it might bring warmth or food. The other stirred weakly at the sound of their grandmother entering. The woman said nothing. She knelt beside them, her knees hitting the concrete with a soft thud that made Jasmine flinch. From the plastic bag, she withdrew 2 bruised bananas and a loaf of bread, with one corner missing. Her hands moved with a gentleness Jasmine couldn't bear to watch, dividing the bread into 3 sections, folding the ends like she was trying to make them look fuller. She gave the fruit to the children and kept nothing for herself. And that was when Jasmine felt it. Not just sorrow, but rage. This was what the debates sanitized. This was what got flattened into bullet points and bar graphs. This was the America no one televised. No hot meals, no beds, no heat. Just a woman who had mopped floors for a decade, feeding children dinner like it was a secret. Jasmine's pulse pounded in her ears. She had sat in rooms where men in suits discussed the working class like a demographic target, but now she saw it up close, cold, hungry, and contained in a box on borrowed land. This wasn't hardship. This was abandonment. And it was happening just 5 miles from the Capitol Dome. Up until now, Jasmine had followed in silence, observing, processing, enduring. But the next few moments inside that rusted shell of survival would not simply wound her, they would redefine her. The woman didn't eat. She didn't even pretend to. Instead, she offered the bread and bananas like a sacred rite, placing each piece gently into the children's hands, as if afraid the food might crumble under the weight of her tenderness. The older child, maybe 10 at most, gave her a puzzled glance and glanced at the near-empty bag. The woman noticed, but she was ready. She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that tried to erase suffering, not with joy, but with discipline. "I had some rice at work, baby," she said softly, brushing a hand over his cheek like a blessing. Jasmine saw the lie land gently, accepted without question, because the children had already learned not to ask too much. The woman sat back, her eyes never leaving their faces as they devoured the modest meal with the hunger of those who know there might not be a next one. Her stomach never growled. Her hands stayed folded. But her face trembled at the edges, a performance of peace unraveling in slow motion. It wasn't the absence of food that broke Jasmine. It was the presence of dignity in the absence of everything else. She turned away from the narrow viewing slit like she'd been struck in the chest. Her hand flew to her mouth, not just to stifle a sob, but to contain something deeper: shame, fury, helplessness, all detonating at once. Her vision blurred, but she didn't blink. She couldn't. Every policy white paper she'd ever read on poverty statistics flashed in her mind like ash. Sterile numbers that suddenly felt insulting in their cold detachment. This wasn't 12.6% child food insecurity. This was two faces in the dark, being lied to out of love. This wasn't a policy failure. This was a moral collapse. Jasmine had fought for labor protections, spoken on house floors about wage gaps, lobbied for child nutrition bills, and yet here she was, 5 miles from Capitol Hill, watching a woman lie to her grandchildren so they wouldn't offer her a bite of bread. Her hands clenched. Her chest rose and fell in sharp, uneven gasps. This wasn't just a broken system. It was a system designed never to see this. But Jasmine saw it now. God help her. She saw it all. The day after witnessing Estella's quiet sacrifice, Jasmine stepped into the store not as a congresswoman, but as a witness to a broken system that had abandoned the very people it was supposed to protect. Her boots clicked against the tile floor, the sharp sound amplifying in the silence, as though the walls themselves could sense what was about to unfold. She walked past the aisles of chips and canned goods, eyes fixed on the counter where the manager, a man in his 40s with an air of weariness about him, stood, his expression blank. The instant he saw her, his face shifted, the recognition flickering in his eyes before being quickly masked by a smile that felt too practiced, too artificial. He greeted her in his usual manner, but there was an underlying tension in his voice, an awareness that something more was being asked than just a simple question. "I need to talk to you about one of your employees," Jasmine said, her voice controlled but firm. The manager blinked, visibly taken aback by her directness. His shoulders stiffened as he leaned back against the counter, his posture defensive. "Estella Reyes, the woman who works the late shift," she continued, her gaze piercing him as she studied his every move. He hesitated, eyes quickly flicking around the store, searching for an escape in the familiar surroundings. Finally he spoke, his voice slower than usual, as though calculating the consequences of the conversation. "Estella? Yeah, she's been with us. About 12 years now. Always on time, never asked for time off, always puts in a full shift." He seemed proud of these facts, as though they were merits worthy of recognition. Jasmine didn't need to hear more. She knew what those words meant. 12 years of loyalty to a company that saw Estella as nothing more than a disposable tool, and in return, she was barely able to feed herself. And she's part-time, right? Jasmine's voice cut through the surface pleasantries. The manager's face faltered for a moment before he nodded, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of understanding, an understanding that this wasn't just an inquiry, but an accusation. Minimum wage, he added quickly, almost defensively, as though he needed to justify it. But those two words landed like bricks. She's not eligible for benefits either. Not full-time, so no health care, no paid leave. That's just how it works here. Jasmine's breath caught in her throat. 12 years of tireless work, and Estella was still living paycheck to paycheck, denied the very benefits that would allow her to survive with dignity. Her stomach twisted with fury, not just at the store, but at the system that had allowed this to happen. Estella had dedicated her body and spirit to making the store run smoothly, to being the invisible backbone of the service economy. She had scrubbed floors for thousands of people, yet in return, she was left hungry, working every day without the assurance of a future. The weight of it all hit Jasmine like a punch to the gut. The injustice wasn't just that Estella was underpaid, it was that she was invisible. A nameless face behind the counter whose years of sacrifice had earned her nothing but an endless struggle to survive. The system had closed its eyes to her, reduced her to a part-time label that barely defined who she was, much less what she was worth. Jasmine clenched her fists, nails digging into her palms. This wasn't just a wage disparity. It was an erasure of humanity. Estella wasn't allowed to have dignity, let alone security. Her mind raced as she thought of how many more Estellas were out there, hidden in plain sight, working themselves to the bone, and receiving nothing in return but more work. She thought of how many more people had been condemned to this cycle of exploitation. She had spent years speaking about inequality, about the disparity between the rich and the poor, about systemic abuse. But standing here, hearing this cold, heartless truth, she realized that the true scale of the injustice wasn't something that could be fixed with a bill or a speech. The problem was far deeper than legislation. It was about a system that refused to value its people. Jasmine took a slow breath, her heart pounding in her chest. "How much longer do you think she can keep doing this?" she asked, her voice low but carrying a weight that made the manager shift uncomfortably under her gaze. He didn't answer, his eyes now avoiding hers, unwilling to face the reality that Jasmine was forcing him to see. Jasmine didn't need him to respond. She already knew the answer. As long as the system allowed her to, Estella would keep going, buried under the weight of a system that cared only for profit. The realization hit Jasmine harder than she expected. It wasn't just a broken system, it was a soul-crushing cycle. Estella had been stripped of her humanity by a world that didn't care if she lived or died, as long as she kept working. Jasmine's chest tightened as her thoughts turned over in her mind, grappling with the immense scale of the injustice. The realization was clear. This wasn't just about Estella. This was about everyone who had been cast aside, whose voices had been drowned out by the noise of the rich and powerful. Her hands trembled with anger. Jasmine's resolve hardened. She wasn't going to walk away. She couldn't. The world could ignore the Estellas for as long as it wanted, but she wasn't going to let them stay invisible. She would fight for her, and for every person who had been erased from the system's view. The fire that burned inside her wasn't just about anger. It was about action. She was ready, and she wouldn't rest until the world saw what she had seen, felt what she had felt, and finally understood the cost of leaving people like Estella behind. That night, the weight of everything Jasmine had witnessed surged within her. This wasn't about policy or speeches. It was about standing face to face with the broken system that had ignored Estella for far too long. Jasmine stood quietly at the edge of the parking lot, the night air cold and crisp against her skin. The store was nearly empty now, the hum of the fluorescent lights inside the only sound breaking the stillness. She had waited for what felt like hours, watching as the shadows deepened around her. There was no hurry, no rush. This moment wasn't about a ticking clock or a set agenda. It was about something raw, about human connection, about seeing someone for the first time when everyone else had looked away. Estella's shift was ending, and Jasmine's heart raced with a mix of anticipation and fear. Fear of what she might say, and fear of the responsibility that had slowly settled in her chest like a heavy stone. When the door creaked open and Estella emerged, the tired woman barely lifted her head, dragging her feet as she made her way to the lot. Her shoulders slumped beneath the weight of exhaustion, and for a moment she looked smaller than she had before, as though the very act of surviving another day had hollowed her out. She didn't see Jasmine immediately, her eyes focused on the ground in front of her, lost in a world that had kept her invisible for too long. The moment stretched between them, and Jasmine felt the gravity of what she had come to do. "Excuse me," Jasmine's voice broke the stillness, soft but firm. Estella looked up quickly, startled, her face a mix of confusion and wariness. She was used to being ignored, used to moving through the world without anyone truly noticing her. Jasmine stepped forward slowly, careful not to startle her, but steady in her intent. This wasn't just a fleeting moment. This was her chance to do what no one else had done. See her. "I'm Jasmine," she said, offering a small, sincere smile, one that didn't carry the weight of power or expectation, but simply the truth. "I'm not here as a congresswoman," Jasmine continued, her voice carrying a softness that matched the calmness of the night. "I'm here as someone who cares." Estella blinked, a look of disbelief crossing her face. She didn't know how to react. No one had ever approached her like this before. No one had ever seen her beyond the floors she scrubbed or the shelves she stocked. No one had ever acknowledged the humanity beneath the exhaustion. Jasmine watched her carefully, giving her space, allowing her to process. The woman before her was wary, her face hardened by years of neglect, her eyes searching for the familiar safety of detachment. The emotional armor she'd perfected through years of hardship. Jasmine understood. She knew the walls that had been built, but Jasmine didn't back away. She took a step closer, not as an authority figure or someone with the power to change the world with a single conversation, but as a person who saw beyond the worn apron, beyond the tired eyes. She saw the woman who had spent 12 years of her life giving everything and receiving nothing in return. And she wanted Estella to know that her struggle was not invisible, that she mattered, that someone finally was paying attention. "If you ever need anything," Jasmine said, her voice quiet but unwavering, "please don't hesitate to reach out. Don't be afraid to ask for help. I'm here for you." The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of all the injustices Jasmine had seen and felt. It was a promise, not of grand gestures, but of a willingness to be present, to listen, to care. Estella's eyes softened as she took in the words, a flicker of something vulnerable passing over her face. The exhaustion that had settled into her features began to shift, not gone, but lighter, as though the burden of invisibility had been momentarily lifted. For a moment, Estella said nothing. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Jasmine could see the hesitation, the disbelief in her eyes, the uncertainty of being allowed to matter in a world that had never given her permission to. Jasmine didn't rush her. She stood quietly, offering only her presence, offering Estella the space to decide whether to trust this moment, whether to trust that someone finally saw her, not as a worker, not as a part-time employee, but as a person. Finally, Estella nodded slightly, her expression still guarded, but the faintest trace of relief in her eyes. There was no grand declaration, no immediate change, but there was a shift, a subtle, powerful moment of connection. Jasmine gave her a small nod in return, a silent understanding passing between them. She had done what no one else had. She had stepped outside the boundaries of her position, of her power, and simply offered something real. The night was still, the world outside the parking lot moving as if nothing had changed. But for Jasmine and Estella, something had shifted, and Jasmine knew, as she walked away, that this was just the beginning. What Jasmine had seen, what she had felt, demanded more than just words. It demanded action, quiet and relentless, because the broken system she had witnessed wasn't going to change itself. Jasmine didn't call for cameras. She didn't want the press buzzing around, making a spectacle of Estella's pain, her struggle. This wasn't about attention. This wasn't about visibility. This was about real, sustained change. And change didn't come in the form of headlines and hashtags. It came quietly, like a ripple on the surface of an ocean that, over time, would move mountains. Jasmine knew that. She had seen too many moments of fleeting fame, too many broken promises made in front of flashing lights. This time, it would be different. She sat at her desk that evening, the soft hum of the city outside her window, reminding her that the world continued to spin, oblivious to the injustices she had just witnessed. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before she began typing. First, a quick message to a nonprofit she knew that worked on housing assistance. Then a call to a friend who had connections with local education foundations. She moved quickly but with care. Each outreach calculated, each connection made with the same quiet urgency. No fanfare, no public rallying cry. Just one person doing what she could to make another's life a little more bearable. Hours passed, and as the evening bled into the night, Jasmine's efforts began to take shape. She didn't wait for answers from the organizations. She knew what she was doing was right, even if it was all happening behind closed doors. This was how it would be done. There would be no grand declarations, no speeches in front of cameras. She would fix what had been broken. She would fight for Estella, not with words, but with results. By the following afternoon, she had secured a small, renovated apartment in a quiet, residential neighborhood, a mere 10-minute walk from a well-rated public school. The apartment had everything it needed: a kitchen stocked with the essentials, fresh paint on the walls, clean floors beneath their feet. The rent had already been paid for 6 months, and Jasmine had made sure that the utilities, water, electricity, heat, were all set up, the bills already covered for the year. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give Estella and her children a new beginning, a chance to start over without the constant weight of survival hanging over them. Jasmine had spent hours on the phone, arranging for the apartment, coordinating with the right people to ensure everything was handled discreetly and efficiently. There was no need for fanfare, no need for anyone to know her name. She just wanted to make sure that Estella would have a roof over her head, a safe space where she could rest at night and not worry about where her next meal would come from. Jasmine didn't ask for anything in return. The system had failed Estella. Now it was up to her, Jasmine Crockett, not as a congresswoman, but as a human being who refused to stand by and do nothing. In addition to securing the apartment, Jasmine turned her attention to Estella's children. The weight of their future hung heavy on her heart. They were children, innocent and full of potential, yet bound by the same system that had failed their mother. The only difference between them and countless other children was that they had been born into a life of hardship, a life where the promise of opportunity felt like a distant dream. Jasmine refused to let them fall through the cracks, as so many did. She immediately set up a scholarship fund for their education. She worked with local foundations, making sure that both children would have the resources they needed to succeed academically. Tuition covered, school supplies provided, extracurricular activities supported. Jasmine even made calls to a local health clinic, arranging for medical care for Estella and her children. They would have access to the health care they deserved, without the burden of worrying about whether they could afford it. Jasmine didn't want them to just survive. She wanted them to thrive. The days that followed were filled with a quiet, relentless determination. Jasmine didn't stop. She didn't slow down. Every email she sent, every phone call she made, every connection she fostered, it was all for Estella and her family. Jasmine knew this would be a long battle. She knew that this was just the beginning. The system that had allowed Estella to slip through the cracks wouldn't change overnight. But what Jasmine had learned in the quiet after the storm was that real change didn't need to come from the top down. It could come from the ground up, and she was going to build it, one brick at a time. By the time Estella was able to move into her new home, Jasmine had already lined up everything she needed: bills covered, education supported, healthcare in place. Estella had no idea what Jasmine had done, nor did she need to. This was not for recognition. It was for dignity. It was for a future where Estella could rest, not having to fight every day just to survive. It was a chance to rebuild, to start anew. Jasmine hadn't just offered a handout. She had offered a future. something far more precious than any temporary fix. The night before Stella's family was to move into the new apartment, Jasmine stood in the quiet of her office, staring out the window at the city lights. She could feel the weight of what she had done settle over her like a warm blanket. But there was no satisfaction in it, only the knowledge that one woman's suffering had been alleviated. But there were still millions more out there, slipping through the cracks just like Estella had. The work wasn't over. It had only just begun. Jasmine knew that her role in this wasn't a singular act of charity. It was part of something bigger, part of a systemic change that had to be made. She couldn't change everything overnight, but she could make sure that at least one person, one family, could stand tall again, with dignity and hope for the future. And in that moment, Jasmine knew that this was the kind of fight she was meant for. Fighting not just for the spotlight, but for the quiet, unseen battles that shaped the world. The next morning she woke early, her resolve as sharp as ever. There was much more to be done, but for now, as she stood in front of Estella's new home, she knew she had made a real difference, and for the first time in a long while, she felt the weight of her purpose clear and steady. A week had passed since Jasmine's quiet, relentless work had begun to take shape, and now the moment she had been working for was finally here. But it was not without the weight of the world on her shoulders. Jasmine stood outside the door of the small, run-down building where Estella worked. The world was moving quickly around her, people coming and going, the usual noise of the city humming in the background. But Jasmine felt the stillness around her. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing against her chest as she held the envelope tightly in her hands. It had been a week since she had taken those first steps to change Estella's life, and now standing here, Jasmine's heart raced. Today wasn't about headlines or political speeches. This was about dignity. This was about showing a woman who had given everything, who had been denied for so long, that she mattered. The door swung open with a soft squeak, and there Estella stood, her tired face lighting up with surprise at the sight of Jasmine. She looked the same, worn from the world, shoulders slumped in exhaustion, yet still carrying that quiet resilience that had pulled her through 12 years of unnoticed labor. She wasn't expecting anything. Why would she? No one had ever given her a reason to expect kindness. No one had ever given her the chance to dream of something better. "Estella," Jasmine said, her voice steady but carrying the weight of everything she had worked for. "I've got something for you." Estella blinked, confused as Jasmine handed her the envelope. For a moment it seemed as if time itself had stopped. Estella's hands hesitated, as though uncertain whether to accept the envelope at all. But then she slowly took it from Jasmine's outstretched hand, her fingers brushing against the paper, almost as if afraid of what was inside. She stared at the envelope, her mind racing with questions, doubt creeping in with every second that passed. This wasn't a world where people just handed out things like this. Estella had never been given anything without having to fight for it, without having to earn it, with nothing ever handed to her on a silver platter. She had no reason to think this would be different. Jasmine stepped back, giving Estella the space she needed, but never losing sight of her. Estella stood there frozen, looking at the envelope as though it were a mystery she couldn't unravel. Finally, her hands began to tremble, and she tore open the envelope slowly. Jasmine's heart pounded in her chest as she watched, knowing what was coming, but still holding her breath in anticipation. The moment Estella unfolded the piece of paper, her eyes widened. For the first time in what felt like forever, a light of disbelief flashed across her face, a spark of something close to hope. Her breath hitched, her hands shaking so violently now that the paper threatened to slip from her grasp. The address of the new apartment, the paid rent, the utilities taken care of, everything that Jasmine had set up for Estella's new beginning, all laid out on a single sheet of paper. But for Estella, it wasn't just an address. It was a lifeline. It was proof that someone had seen her. It was proof that she mattered. Estella's eyes welled up with tears, and in that instant, Jasmine could see the dam that had been holding her back break. Estella's body trembled as the weight of the revelation hit her. The truth of what Jasmine had done, the gesture of humanity, of kindness, of real, tangible help, was too much for Estella to process all at once. She dropped the paper, her hands flying to her face as tears began to spill down her cheeks. She couldn't speak at first. her body racked with sobs that she had held in for too long. She had been living in a world where survival meant closing off everything, where hope was something others had, but never her. Now all of that was crashing down in a rush of overwhelming emotion. Without warning, Estella stepped forward and enveloped Jasmine in a fierce, desperate hug, clinging to her as if she could absorb this moment, this reality, and make it her own. Jasmine's chest tightened at the rawness of the embrace, the woman she had fought for finally breaking free of the years of struggle that had defined her life. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of everything unsaid hanging in the air like a storm, both of them holding on to the moment as if it were the only thing that could ground them. Estella pulled back slightly, her face red from crying, her eyes wide with disbelief, as though she still couldn't quite understand what had just happened. She looked at Jasmine, her voice barely a whisper, but the words carrying the weight of a lifetime. "I don't deserve this," she choked out, her words cracking under the strain of emotion. "I don't deserve this kindness." Jasmine's heart broke a little more at those words. No, Estella didn't deserve to be in this position, but she had never been given the chance to feel worthy of this kind of kindness, of this kind of grace. Jasmine took a step closer, lifting Estella's chin gently so their eyes met. The anger that had been bubbling inside her over the past week, the fury at a system that had allowed this to happen, was now tempered by a fierce determination. "You do deserve this," Jasmine said, her voice low but firm. "You don't just deserve it, Estella. You are an inspiration. You've given everything for your family, for your community, and no one ever gave you a reason to believe you mattered. But you do, and that is why I'm here. Because you've shown me what real strength is. I'm just doing what's right." Estella's lip trembled as she absorbed the weight of Jasmine's words. She shook her head in disbelief, tears still spilling down her cheeks, but a soft smile began to tug at the corners of her lips. This wasn't just relief. It was the first real sense of hope she had felt in years. And it was because someone had seen her, not as a worker, not as a problem, but as a human being, worthy of dignity, love, and care. For a long time, Jasmine stood there, not saying anything more, allowing the silence to speak for them. Estella wasn't ready for grand speeches. She wasn't ready to hear more words about justice or politics. All she needed was this, a moment of truth, of being seen, and Jasmine had made sure it was real. As the two women stood together, the weight of a broken system momentarily lifted. Jasmine knew that this was only the beginning. The fight would continue, but for now Estella had something that had been denied to her for so long. Hope. And in that hope, Jasmine could see the future. A future where maybe the system would change, where more people like Estella wouldn't have to fight for their dignity. But for now, this was enough, and in this moment, Jasmine felt more alive, more connected to her purpose than she ever had before. She had made a difference, and that, she thought, was worth everything. The next morning, Estella's family stepped into the new apartment. But what Jasmine saw unfold before her eyes wasn't just a new chapter. It was the raw reality of what was possible when someone cared enough to make a difference. Jasmine stood across the street, her gaze fixed on the small apartment building where Estella's family was about to begin a new life. The morning light had begun to warm the cool air, but Jasmine's heart felt heavy, anchored by the weight of what she had seen. She had watched the transformation of Estella's world from one of hardship and despair to a space filled with the potential for something better. It wasn't much, a modest apartment in a quiet neighborhood, but for Estella and her children, it was everything. The door to the apartment building swung open, and Estella stepped out with her two children, their faces unsure but filled with the kind of hope that only comes with the promise of change. Estella's eyes scanned the space, almost as if she couldn't believe it. It was a scene so simple, so ordinary, yet so extraordinary in the context of everything that had led to this moment. The children, barely old enough to understand what was happening, suddenly broke into laughter, their voices echoing against the walls of the building. One of the children ran ahead, slapping his hand against the walls, as if testing the reality of this new space. He jumped onto the carpet with such abandon, as if it were a trampoline. His sister followed closely, her eyes wide, her face alight with disbelief. She tugged at Estella's sleeve, pulling her mother's attention to the bare walls, to the simple furniture already placed in the living room, to the untouched kitchen counters and the fresh, clean air of their new home. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, they weren't just surviving, they were living. Jasmine watched quietly from across the street, her hands folded together, but her eyes sharp. She didn't take out her phone. She didn't snap a photo. She didn't start a live stream. There was no need for public validation. No need to parade this moment as a spectacle for the world to see. This wasn't about generating clicks or collecting applause. It was about the truth of what was happening. This was about a woman who had been neglected by the system, who had been told for years that her worth didn't matter, now getting a chance to rebuild her life. And Jasmine knew that no camera could capture the significance of this moment. The joy in the children's laughter, the hope on Estella's face, was far more powerful than any viral video could ever be. As Estella and the children made their way inside the apartment, Jasmine took a deep breath, her thoughts swirling with the images of the countless families, the countless workers, who never got this chance. She could have easily posted a picture, shown the world what she had done, what she had accomplished. But as she stood there, she understood something much more profound. This wasn't about headlines. This wasn't about spreading a message for the sake of approval. It was about dignity, real, tangible dignity. A dignity that couldn't be reduced to a catchy hashtag or a viral post. This was about giving Estella and her children the chance to live a life where their worth wasn't defined by the hours they worked, the sweat they poured into their jobs, or the debt they carried. Jasmine turned to her assistant, who had been standing quietly beside her. The assistant had been with her through every step of this journey, helping with logistics, calls, and making sure every detail had been taken care of. Jasmine could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the moment hanging between them. She looked at her assistant and spoke softly but firmly, the words carrying the depth of everything she had just witnessed. "We don't need cameras," Jasmine said, her voice calm but resolute. "We need real justice. We need a justice that's not just for show, but for people like Estella, people who have been ignored and forgotten for too long. This isn't about me, and it's not about getting credit. It's about making sure that people like her, the ones who make this country run, are given the life they deserve." Her assistant nodded, understanding exactly what Jasmine meant. They had both been through too many meetings, too many speeches, too many empty promises from politicians who had never had to live through what Estella had lived through. Jasmine knew that the fight wasn't over. This was just the beginning. There were millions more families out there, hidden in the shadows of a broken system, and Jasmine knew, deep in her bones, that the work would continue. It had to. The children's laughter filtered through the air, reaching Jasmine's ears. Estella appeared in the doorway of the apartment, her eyes bright, her shoulders a little less burdened than they had been a week ago. She looked over at Jasmine, a soft smile forming on her lips, and for a moment there was nothing else in the world. No politics, no systems, just a woman and her children, standing at the threshold of a new life. Jasmine smiled back, her heart swelling with a quiet pride. This was why she did this, why she fought. Not for headlines, not for praise, but for moments like this. For the chance to give someone back their dignity, to show them that they mattered. She didn't need anyone to see this. She didn't need validation. This was the kind of justice that lived in the quiet moments, in the spaces where no one was looking. This was the kind of change that, once set in motion, could never be undone. As Estella and her children moved further into the apartment, their laughter echoing, Jasmine took one last look at the building that now symbolized something far greater than the sum of its walls and windows. It symbolized the beginning of a new future, a future where people like Estella, who had been forced to sacrifice everything for so long, could finally be given the space to live. Jasmine knew, as she turned and walked away, that the fight would continue, just as it always had. But for now she could rest, not because the battle was over, but because, in that moment, she had won something real. She had given a family the gift of hope. And in a world that often seems built on taking from those who have nothing, that was a victory worth more than any victory she could win on a campaign stage. As the door to Estella's new home closed softly behind her, Jasmine stood there, the weight of her quiet victory settling in. But she knew deep down that what they had achieved wasn't enough. The lesson was clear, painful, and undeniable. This was only one moment in a battle that would take far more than just one act of kindness. The world around Jasmine seemed to blur as she turned away from the apartment building, her mind still processing everything that had just happened. Estella's family, full of joy and disbelief, now had the chance to live in a place they could call home. But that truth, their truth, was a rare exception. Jasmine could feel the burn of frustration in her chest as she walked, each step echoing with the weight of the injustice she had witnessed. Every day, thousands of people like Estella lived in shadows, their struggles invisible to a society that chose not to see them. Estella had fought for her family, had survived the overwhelming burden of poverty for 12 years. But how many others had been left behind, forgotten by the system that was supposed to serve them? The work was far from over. Jasmine could feel the pressure of that truth pushing against her ribs. She had done something good, something that mattered for Estella and her children. But that act of charity was only a temporary solution to a much deeper problem. She had made a difference in their lives, but how many others were still out there, fighting the same fight, with no one to give them a helping hand? The injustice of it all consumed her thoughts as she walked, her pace quickening, the fire of righteous anger burning deeper with every step. The system that had allowed Estella to slip through the cracks, that had labeled her as part-time and dismissed her as nothing more than a cog in the machine, was still in place. The corporation that paid her minimum wage, that kept her hours short so they wouldn't have to offer benefits, was still profiting off the labor of people like Estella. Jasmine clenched her fists as she walked, her knuckles white against the tension in her hands. How was this allowed to happen? How was it that hardworking people like Estella could spend years building the foundation of their community, only to be cast aside when they were no longer needed? How could society allow people to work themselves to the bone and still live in fear of not being able to feed their families, to survive the next week? Jasmine felt a fire stirring within her, and for a moment she stopped walking, her breath heavy as she faced the reality she had been trying to ignore. The injustice she had seen wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't an accident. It was the design of a system that was built to keep the wealthy in power and the rest of the world struggling to survive. Every time she heard someone talk about economic growth or productivity, she saw Estella's tired face, her cracked hands, her empty stomach, and the lie of a system that promised opportunity but only delivered exploitation. Jasmine had lived in that world of politics and corporate speeches, of false promises and empty gestures, and now she could see clearly that it wasn't enough. She was one person, but the power of the system was vast. It spread through every institution, every law, every policy, every corporation. And for the first time, Jasmine realized that this wasn't just a battle against individuals. This was a war against an entire structure, one that had been built over decades and had become so entrenched that it was almost invisible to those who benefited from it. The very system that had allowed Estella to be mistreated had also allowed Jasmine herself to succeed. She had been born into a different set of privileges, a different set of opportunities. And she was angry. Angry at the world for allowing so many people to be left behind, for allowing them to be treated like they didn't matter, like their lives were worth less than the profit of a corporation. But even in the face of that anger, Jasmine knew she couldn't simply burn the system down and walk away. It wasn't that simple. This was not a fight that could be won with a single act of defiance or with a single person standing up to make a difference. It was a war, a battle that would require everyone who cared about justice to step up and fight. She couldn't change the system overnight, but she could use her voice, her position, her platform to raise awareness, to demand accountability, and to make sure that stories like Estella's weren't silenced. Jasmine walked into the office later that day, her mind still swirling with the weight of the lesson she had just learned. Her assistant was already at her desk, organizing papers and answering calls, but the moment she saw Jasmine, she knew something had changed. There was a new fire in Jasmine's eyes, a new determination that hadn't been there before. She had always been a fighter, but now she had a new clarity. She knew exactly what needed to be done, and she wasn't going to stop until it was done. We need to do more, Jasmine said, her voice steady but filled with urgency. The assistant nodded, sensing the shift in her. Jasmine continued, her words gaining strength as she spoke. We can't just keep handing out solutions to the people who need them most. We need to dismantle the system that has kept them in this place for so long. We need to build a world where people like Estella can thrive, not just survive. A world where no one has to choose between working themselves to death and feeding their family. The assistant looked at Jasmine, a mix of admiration and understanding in her eyes. Jasmine's words were not just a call for action, they were a battle cry. The fight had moved from personal charity to systemic change, and there was no going back. Jasmine was done playing by the rules of a broken system. It was time to rewrite the rules. Time to take the fight to the root of the problem. As the days passed, Jasmine's resolve hardened. She used her platform, her connections, and her voice to rally support for policies that would protect workers like Estella, policies that would guarantee fair wages, benefits, and protections for those who had been left behind for too long. She fought for affordable housing, for education, for health care, things that should have been guaranteed to every citizen but had been treated as luxuries instead of rights. Jasmine knew it wouldn't be easy. She knew the battle would be long and hard, but she also knew that if she didn't fight for justice, then who would? Her first step was to meet with lawmakers, pushing for new legislation that would hold corporations accountable for the way they treated their workers. She didn't back down when the opposition fought her at every turn. Every time someone told her it couldn't be done, she pressed harder. She knew the system could change, but it would take more than just a few people to make it happen. It would take every voice, every hand, every heart that believed in justice. Jasmine knew that Estella's victory wasn't just for Estella, it was for every worker, every mother, every child who had ever been denied their due. This was a victory that extended far beyond a single family, a single apartment. It was a victory that could ripple across the nation, shaking the foundations of the system that had kept so many in chains for so long. And Jasmine wasn't going to stop until that ripple became a tidal wave. As she walked into her office, her thoughts steady and her path clear, Jasmine smiled softly to herself. She had fought one battle, but the war? That was just beginning. And this time, she would make sure the world saw it for what it was. She would make sure no one was forgotten Jasmine had made her stand. And now the real work was about to begin. The system that had kept people like Estella in the shadows for so long was going to face the light, whether it liked it or not. Jasmine stood before the chamber, her heart pounding in her chest but her voice unyielding. She had spent her entire career navigating the corridors of power, but today was different. Today she wasn't here to play the game. She wasn't here to placate anyone. Today she was here to fight for justice, the injustice she had witnessed in Estella's life. The quiet suffering of workers who were exploited, ignored, and abandoned had ignited something in Jasmine. It wasn't just about Estella anymore. It was about all the Estellas out there, the people who kept the world turning while the system ground them into dust. The lights above hummed in the silence of the room, the tension thick in the air as Jasmine took the microphone. She looked around at the faces before her. Lawmakers, corporate sponsors, lobbyists, all of them invested in the status quo. But Jasmine wasn't afraid. This was the moment she had been waiting for. "We've heard enough speeches," she said, her voice carrying the weight of everything she had seen and felt. "We've heard enough promises. What we need now is action." Her words cut through the room like a blade, and she could feel the room stiffen. They weren't expecting this. They weren't expecting her to speak like this, to confront them with the truth of what was happening just outside these walls. "For far too long," Jasmine continued, her voice rising, "the people who make this country run have been treated like they don't matter. We've built this system on their backs, and we've left them to rot in poverty, to suffer in silence. And for what? For a few more dollars in the pockets of those who already have everything?" The room shifted uncomfortably, and Jasmine saw their eyes flicker nervously. She could feel the shift, the realization that they weren't going to escape this. Not today. "You've all turned a blind eye to the suffering of millions of people. People like Estella, who have worked day in and day out, only to be told they don't matter. Well, I'm here to tell you they do matter. They matter more than your profits. They matter more than your bottom line. And we are done waiting. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. But Jasmine didn't break. She stood tall, her voice unwavering. You have a choice to make, she said, looking directly at the lawmakers. You can continue to ignore the people who make this economy run, or you can stand with them, with us, and fight for what's right. But you can't have it both ways. You can't keep pretending that everything is fine when families like Estella's are living in fear, living in the margins, barely scraping by. That ends now. She paused for a moment, letting the weight of her words sink in. Jasmine had never been more certain of her purpose than she was in this moment. She wasn't speaking for herself anymore. She wasn't just trying to make a point. She was speaking for all the people who had been left behind, all the workers who had given everything and received nothing in return. We don't need more empty words, Jasmine said, her voice low but powerful. We need real action. We need fair wages. We need health care for all. And we need a system that doesn't just protect the rich and powerful, but that protects everyone. We need justice. Now. The room was still, but Jasmine could feel it. Something was shifting. The power was no longer just with the politicians and the corporations. The power was with the people. It had always been with the people. And now, finally, they were starting to realize that. Jasmine took a breath, steadying herself before she finished. This isn't about me. This isn't about making headlines. This is about doing what's right. And if you can't do that, if you can't stand up for the people who need it most, then maybe it's time for you to step aside. She turned to leave the podium, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't need their approval. She didn't need their validation. She had already made her stand, and she knew deep down that it was the right one. The fight for Estella and everyone like her had only just begun. And this time, Jasmine wouldn't stop until the world saw them, until they were finally given the justice they deserved. As she walked out of the chamber, Jasmine felt the weight of the battle ahead, but she was ready. She was more determined than ever. The fight for justice had only just begun, and nothing would stop her. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. In a small, struggling diner, Tasha, a single mother, faces a moment that could shatter her world. She's $3.25 short for a meal, and the birthday she promised her son, Malik, seems impossible. But as the cashier prepares to call the manager, Jasmine, a stranger at the counter, steps in without hesitation, paying for their meal and offering a chance that could change everything. In just one fateful moment, a simple act of kindness transforms Tasha's life and gives her hope where there was none. Will this one gesture spark a new beginning, or will the weight of the world pull them back into despair? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The rain didn't fall. It attacked, slamming against Jasmine Crockett's windshield like a warning shot from a world on edge. Houston's streets stretched out ahead, slick and empty, bathed in the cold shimmer of streetlights, reflecting off puddles like broken promises. Jasmine had just left a heated summit on economic injustice, her mind still echoing with voices too often ignored. Mothers skipping meals, veterans denied care, children surviving off vending machine snacks. She had spoken with fire, exposing the rot behind polished charts. But now, driving alone through the storm, that fire flickered against the weight of reality. She pulled into a battered fast food place, faded sign, broken neon, a beacon for the weary. Inside, the air smelled of grease and resignation. No one noticed her, just another face among the forgotten. And in that moment, she preferred it that way. The door to the fast food joint creaked open, its sound piercing the silence like an unwelcome intrusion. A woman stepped inside, her clothes drenched from the rain, every inch of her soaked through. Tasha moved with a quiet urgency, her hand tightly clutching her son Malik's. guiding him through the door as if the weight of the world had momentarily been lifted off her shoulders. But the moment they crossed the threshold, that weight came rushing back. Malik, small and oblivious to the storm outside and the storm inside, beamed up at her with eyes full of excitement. His wide smile, untainted by the harshness of life, shone brighter than any streetlight that flickered in the rain-soaked city. "Mom, is today the party day?" he asked, his voice bright and eager. The innocent hope in his question hit Tasha like a punch to the gut. She forced a smile, her heart heavy with the truths she couldn't yet tell him. "Yes, baby," she replied, her voice trembling ever so slightly, betraying the weight of the lie. "Today's a special day." They moved to a small booth in the corner, where Tasha could feel the gaze of the few scattered patrons in the room, though none seemed to notice her as she and Malik settled in. The tables around them, filled with people lost in their own worlds, suddenly felt colder, more distant. Malik climbed up onto the seat with a grin, bouncing with anticipation. He was too young to understand the gravity of the moment, too innocent to sense that every smile she gave him was a mask for the panic racing in her chest. He was thrilled by the thought of a birthday party, his mind filled with simple joys. A slice of cake, a few presents, and perhaps some ice cream. Tasha, on the other hand, could barely hold it together. Her fingers brushed the edge of her pocket, feeling the cold metal of the coins inside. She had counted them 3 times already, $4, barely enough to pay for both their meals, let alone the dream of a celebration she had promised him. Her heart ached. How could she disappoint him? She couldn't, no matter how thin the string was she was walking on. She watched Malik's small hands unwrap the worn backpack slung over his shoulder, his excitement rising as he chattered away about dinosaurs in space, completely unaware of the silent calculations running through his mother's mind. She fought the pang of guilt gnawing at her, the bitter realization that she couldn't give him what he deserved. She was a mother who had promised him a party, a simple gift of joy, but in the end all she could offer was this, a meal that barely scratched the surface of what she had hoped to give. Yet somehow she pushed those thoughts aside. Today was special, she reminded herself. Today Malik was happy, and that she would protect at all costs. Tasha stood in front of the counter, her hands clammy, her heart pounding in her chest. The menu above was a blur of prices and pictures, each one more out of reach than the last. She had always imagined moments like this differently. Birthday parties, laughter, cake. But now she was trapped in the stark reality of what she could afford. Malik, standing at her side, pointed excitedly at the picture of a taco combo on the board. His eyes sparkled with the pure joy of a child, so full of hope it broke her heart. "Can I get that one, Mom?" The taco with the drink? His voice was laced with enthusiasm, his innocent excitement palpable. Tasha's throat tightened, the weight of his expectation crushing her. She turned to the cashier, trying to mask the panic threatening to bubble to the surface. Her hand moved to her purse, fingers grazing the few crumpled bills she had left. She could already hear the words she had to say next, the ones that would strip away any hope for a special day. She glanced back at Malik, who was still smiling up at her, so unaware of the struggle that churned inside her. "Just a minute, sweetie," she whispered, her voice barely a murmur. She shifted her gaze to the menu again, trying to block out the buzzing of uncertainty in her mind. With a shaky breath, she spoke, the words tasting bitter as they left her lips. "I'll take the smallest combo," she said, her voice steady but hollow. "No drink, no fries." The words felt like an admission of failure, a surrender to the cold reality that her son's birthday would not be what he had dreamed. The cashier nodded without looking up, punching in the order with a mechanical click, indifferent to the woman standing before him, trying to keep it together. Malik, blissfully unaware, bounced in place, his excitement unwavering. His small hands were still clenched in anticipation, his eyes glued to the counter, where the food was being prepared. He was so eager for the day to be perfect, not knowing that everything about this moment was far from it. "Are you going to eat, Mom?" he asked innocently, his voice soft, full of concern. The question sliced through Tasha's heart like a blade, her chest tightening with the sting of guilt. She smiled, but it was a smile that didn't reach her eyes, a mask she had perfected over the years. I'll eat later, sweetie, she said, her voice shaking just slightly. Today is your day. The words felt empty as soon as they left her mouth. Today is your day. The words that should have been filled with joy, hope, and celebration now felt like a cruel lie. She forced herself to nod, to hold his hand tightly, to make him believe that she was just as excited as he was. But inside, she was falling apart. Her stomach growled painfully, a constant reminder of the empty space she had been trying to ignore, of the sacrifice she had made so that Malik could enjoy his special day. He didn't know, couldn't know. He was still a child, and this moment for him was magical. For her, it was a battlefield of survival, a quiet war that raged inside her heart. The cashier's voice cut through the air like a blade. "You're short $3.25, she said flatly, her tone devoid of any warmth, any empathy. Just a statement, a fact, as though it meant nothing more than the price of a pack of gum. Tasha's breath caught in her throat. The words reverberated inside her head, over and over, and for a moment she couldn't move, couldn't think. Her heart raced in her chest, every beat thudding like a warning. She had counted the money. She knew how much she had. Just enough for a small meal, just enough to get by. But now the gap between what she had and what was needed felt like an insurmountable chasm. Her hand trembled as it reached into her purse, fingers scraping against the fabric, pulling out the crumpled bills she had hoped she wouldn't need. She sifted through the handful of change, coins slipping through her fingers like sand. Her breath became shallow, the walls of the fast food restaurant pressing in on her from all sides. She could feel the eyes of the others on her, the weight of their gazes, each glance like a judgment, a silent accusation. The ticking of the clock on the wall, the hum of the fryer in the back, the shuffling of trays, all of it blended into a single suffocating noise, a sound that made her feel small, insignificant, invisible. The group of young men at the table to her right couldn't help but laugh. Their voices were sharp, mocking, as if they saw her struggle as some kind of joke. Tasha's cheeks burned, the heat of humiliation rising faster than she could push it down. She turned away, hoping to escape their cruel amusement, but the laughter followed her, echoing in her ears. She could see them out of the corner of her eye, leaning back in their chairs, exchanging smirks, their eyes gleaming with superiority. The cruel reality hit harder than anything they could have said. She wasn't just struggling for a meal, she was struggling in front of an audience, one that had no intention of looking away. And then, from behind her, the soft clink of another unwanted sound. An elderly woman sitting alone at a nearby table shook her head slowly, a faint sigh escaping her lips. It wasn't the sympathy that Tasha wanted to see, but pity. Quiet, disapproving pity. The kind of look that made Tasha feel like she was nothing more than a statistic, a face in the crowd that didn't matter, didn't belong. The woman didn't say a word, but the glance, the slight dip of her head, spoke volumes. Tasha's stomach twisted, as if the very act of her presence in this space was a burden. She could almost hear the thoughts running through the woman's mind. She's just like the others, isn't she? Always asking for help, always needing something more. "Mom?" Malik's voice pierced through the haze of embarrassment, soft and uncertain, a question that stung more than any insult. She turned to him, and for a moment all she could see was the innocence in his eyes, the small crease of concern on his forehead as he tried to make sense of what was happening. Her heart cracked as she fought to hold herself together, to shield him from the storm inside her. "Mom, what's wrong?" His voice was gentle, laced with the pure confusion of a child who had never known such weight. Tasha swallowed hard, her throat tight, the lump of humiliation lodged in her chest. She couldn't answer him, couldn't give him the truth, couldn't explain that the world wasn't fair, that there would be times like this when she would have to swallow her pride and sacrifice her dignity just to survive. She forced a smile, but it was thin, brittle, a facade she wore because she had no other choice. She kept her voice steady, her hands shaking slightly as she reached down and squeezed Malik's small hand. "It's okay, sweetie," she whispered, forcing the words out. "Everything's fine. We'll figure it out." But inside, Tasha knew the truth. She was drowning, Every moment she spent here, in front of those eyes, the eyes of strangers who would never understand, felt like one more step toward losing herself. The silence of the moment felt like a thunderstorm on the horizon, imminent and suffocating. Tasha's hand trembled as it reached into her purse for the last time, fingers brushing against the cold metal of the coins, the rough texture of crumpled bills. Her heart raced, the weight of the situation pressing down on her chest like a vice. She had counted this money. She knew there was enough for a simple meal. But now the register's total stared back at her like a cruel reminder that she was wrong. The gap was small, just $3.25. But it felt like an impossible chasm. Her pulse quickened, and for a brief moment, everything around her seemed to blur. The world felt too big, too loud, and she was just one small person, stranded in the middle of it all. The cashier's voice cut through the panic like a knife, cold and impersonal. "If you don't have enough money, you'll need to leave your ID or leave the restaurant," she said, her words so matter-of-fact, so devoid of any trace of humanity. The sharpness of her tone sent a chill down Tasha's spine, as if the woman was simply stating the rules of a game Tasha hadn't known she was playing. The word leave hung in the air like a sentence, a judgment, a condemnation. Tasha's chest tightened as her hand stopped moving. The coins in her palm felt heavier now, each one a reminder of how little she had left. She had come here hoping for a small victory, a sliver of happiness for Malik. But now the walls of the restaurant seemed to close in on her. The air thickened, stifling, as the other customers' eyes seemed to weigh down on her, their glances a sharp contrast to the warmth she had hoped for. Malik, unaware of the gravity of the situation, stood by her side, his face lit with confusion. His small voice, filled with innocence and curiosity, made Tasha's heart ache. "Are we getting kicked out, Mom?" he asked, his words a soft question that pierced her with the force of 1,000 truths. He had no idea how much she wanted to shield him from this, how much she wanted to protect him from the ugliness of a world that could be so indifferent, so unkind. His face, searching her eyes for reassurance, was the very picture of innocence. Unfamiliar with rejection, untouched by the harshness that lay just beneath the surface. Tasha's breath caught in her throat. She bent down, her knees feeling like they might buckle beneath her. She reached out and gently placed her hand on Malik's shoulder, her fingers trembling against the fabric of his jacket. She forced a smile, though it felt like the weakest thing she had ever done, and whispered, "It's okay, sweetie. Don't worry, everything's fine." Her words were hollow, barely more than a murmur of what she wished were true. She had to keep it together, had to shield Malik from the ugly truth that was unfolding in front of them. But in that moment, as her gaze flickered across the room, she could feel the weight of the world crashing down on her. The cashier's eyes, the cold indifference, the judgmental glances from the other customers. It all felt like a reflection of everything she had faced, everything she had fought against, and yet everything she was still losing. She stood up slowly, her body heavy with exhaustion, and forced herself to move toward the counter, feeling the sting of humiliation like an open wound. The world around her felt distant, as if she were moving through a haze. She could hear the faint murmur of voices behind her, the laughter of the young men, the clink of silverware from the other tables. But it all felt muffled, distant. All she could focus on was the hollow ache in her chest and the feeling that she was fading, slipping through the cracks of a world that seemed to have no place for someone like her. Malik's voice brought her back, soft and worried. "Mom, I'm scared," he whispered, and in that moment, Tasha realized she was terrified too. Terrified that she would fail him, that she would never be able to protect him from the cold, unfeeling world outside. From her corner seat beneath the flickering ceiling light, Jasmine Crockett didn't blink. Her hands remained wrapped around a paper cup of tea, its warmth barely registering against the rising heat in her chest. She had watched the entire scene unfold, the trembling hands, the crumpled bills, the cashier's dismissive voice like cold metal scraping across stone. She saw Tasha's jaw tighten, her shoulders sink, and the desperation behind her smile as she tried to comfort her son with lies she never should have had to say. Malik's question, "Are we getting kicked out?" still hung in the air like smoke after a fire. The whole place had grown quiet, But it wasn't compassion, it was spectatorship. Jasmine knew that silence. She'd heard it in courtrooms and on Capitol Hill, moments when injustice was about to happen, and no one dared stop it. Her grip tightened on the cup, fingers twitching with restraint. But when the cashier shifted toward the phone, clearly reaching for the manager, Jasmine moved, slowly, deliberately. Not out of impulse, but with the weight of every mother who's ever been told she doesn't belong. She stood, her chair sliding back, with a low scrape against the tile that seemed to wake the room. The people who'd been so eager to stare now fell silent, their gazes narrowing in confusion. Jasmine walked with the kind of calm that made people uneasy. Silent strength wrapped in purpose. Each step toward the counter felt like a challenge to the atmosphere itself. She passed the judgmental glances, the whispering teens, the old woman who'd offered pity but not help, and she never once broke eye contact with the cashier. As she reached the register, she pulled her wallet from her coat with precision. No theatrics, no hesitation. Her credit card slid across the counter with a quiet finality. The cashier blinked, caught off guard. Jasmine's voice came low, steady, unmistakably commanding. "I'll cover the bill." Her tone was neither kind nor cold, it was clear, certain. Then she added, locking eyes with the wide-eyed Malik just behind his mother, "And make sure he gets a birthday cake, a real one." The silence in the room shifted, not broken, but redefined. No one spoke. The manager, who had begun approaching, stopped mid-step. The cashier looked from the card to Jasmine's face, searching for a reaction, some signal of ego, of attention-seeking. But there was none. Just that quiet, resolute calm. Jasmine turned slightly, her eyes meeting Tasha's for the first time. No words passed between them. None were needed. In Jasmine's eyes, there was no pity, only respect, a silent recognition. The look of one woman telling another, "You're not invisible. Not today." Tasha stood motionless, her fingers clenched tightly around the crumpled $5 bill as she slowly walked back to the table, the weight of every step bearing down on her. Her heart pounded in her chest, the shame of the situation washing over her like a wave that wouldn't recede. She didn't want to look at Malik, didn't want to see the confusion in his innocent eyes as he tried to make sense of what was happening. He had no idea what was unfolding, what kind of world he was growing up in. A world where a mother's worth was measured by the empty spaces in her wallet, the fleeting opportunities she could grasp for him. She had failed him, she thought. She had promised him a celebration, something simple and sweet, and now she was returning, defeated with nothing more than a handful of excuses. But then, as she reached the booth, her breath caught in her throat. The scene in front of her stopped everything. Malik was sitting there, not with the sad, vacant look of disappointment she expected, but with a wide grin, his face aglow with pure joy. He was sitting in front of a full meal, fries, a giant taco, and a drink, and beside the plate was a small cake, a birthday candle flickering brightly atop it. The sight was surreal. Tasha blinked twice as if trying to make sense of it, but the reality of the moment didn't change. Malik's excitement was palpable, his little hands clapping with glee as he eagerly looked up at her, the childlike wonder in his eyes. The joy that could only come from an untainted heart was like a sharp contrast to the anxiety she had felt just moments before. Her mind raced to catch up with her emotions. The $5 she had just desperately clutched, the feeling of inadequacy that had consumed her, seemed so insignificant in the face of this unexpected act. She glanced around, her eyes searching for any answers, any clue as to how this had happened. Who had done this? She turned to the cashier, her voice shaky as she asked, "What's going on? Why is there food? Why is there a cake?" She could barely understand what had happened herself. The cashier looked at her with a mixture of uncertainty and quiet respect. She seemed almost taken aback by the question, as though it were an ordinary moment she'd witnessed many times, but for Tasha, it was anything but ordinary. "A woman paid for your meal," the cashier explained, her tone softer now, almost apologetic. "She didn't want you to have to leave without something. She just wanted you and your son to have a proper birthday. She wanted to make sure you could enjoy this moment, even if just for today." Tasha's breath caught, a lump forming in her throat as the weight of the words settled in. She turned to look at Malik, whose smile had not faded. He was too young to understand the full significance of the gesture, too innocent to know that the meal and the cake were not part of some birthday magic, but the simple, selfless act of a stranger who saw her struggle and refused to let her fail in front of her child. For a moment, Tasha felt something unfamiliar, a brief flicker of warmth. It was the smallest sliver of light in a world that had often felt so dark. But as quickly as the warmth came, it was replaced with a sharp, nagging reality. Why? Why did this woman, this stranger, feel the need to intervene? Why had it taken the kindness of a completely unknown person for her to get something so simple? A birthday meal, a cake. The unfairness of it burned in her chest. There were too many people in the world, just like her, who would never have this moment, who would never have someone step in and offer a slice of humanity when everything else felt impossible. She glanced back at the cashier, who had turned away to tend to other customers, and then to Malik, still sitting happily in front of the meal that should have been hers to provide. The joy in his eyes should have been hers too, the fulfillment of a mother's promise. But instead it was someone else who had to step in, someone who probably didn't even know the depth of her struggle. And that was the hardest truth of all. In a world so full of wealth and power, where justice seemed so distant, it was kindness that had to bridge the gap. Tasha took a deep breath, her eyes still locked on Malik, who was now picking up his taco, completely unaware of the storm of emotions swirling inside his mother. In that moment she knew, more than ever, how fragile this world was, how deeply unfair it could be, and how far she would go to make sure he never saw the same struggles she had to face. The simple act of a stranger had given her hope. Hope she wasn't sure she deserved, but that she would cling to for as long as she could. Jasmine moved quietly, her steps deliberate and measured, as if she were walking through something sacred, something fragile. The air around the table shifted as she sat down across from Tasha and Malik, her presence not demanding attention, but commanding respect. She didn't need to announce herself. There was a quiet strength in her demeanor that spoke louder than any words could. Malik, still absorbed in the meal in front of him, didn't even notice the shift in the atmosphere, his small face lighting up with a smile that belonged to someone who had no knowledge of the struggles his mother had faced or the quiet rebellion that had just unfolded in the room. Jasmine's eyes flickered over to him, and for a moment she allowed herself to smile back, the weight of her own history reflected in the innocence of his. Tasha, however, couldn't pull her gaze away from the woman sitting across from her. Her mind was still racing, trying to comprehend the events that had just transpired. The unexpected kindness, the stranger who had covered her meal, the birthday cake that Malik had been gifted without explanation. As Tasha stared at Jasmine, the realization hit her. She knew who this woman was. She had seen her before, heard her name in the news, seen her stand before the world, demanding justice for those who couldn't speak for themselves. But now sitting before her, Jasmine didn't carry the weight of a title or the formality of a politician. She carried something far more powerful: empathy, solidarity, the unspoken understanding of what it meant to struggle, to fight for your family, for dignity, in a world that so often overlooked you. Tasha blinked, the confusion and awe in her eyes deepening as the recognition sank in. You're Jasmine Crockett, aren't you?" The words slipped from her lips, almost in disbelief, as if the woman sitting before her could not possibly be the same figure she had seen on the news, the one who had stood so confidently against the injustices that ran rampant in the world. Jasmine didn't flinch. Her eyes met Tasha's without hesitation, her smile genuine but not patronizing, simply knowing. "I'm just another mother," Jasmine replied softly, her voice steady and full of conviction, yet warm with the comfort of shared experience. "I've had empty pockets too. I've walked into places like this, not knowing how I'd make it through, feeling the weight of every choice. But you carry on because you have to." Her words weren't some grand declaration. They weren't intended to inspire or to elevate her in any way. They were the quiet truths of someone who had been there, who had felt the sting of defeat, the raw vulnerability that came with being just one small person in a world that never quite saw you. There was no sense of superiority in her tone, only the raw honesty of someone who knew exactly what Tasha was feeling and what she had been forced to swallow in order to survive. For a long moment, Tasha didn't speak. She just sat there staring at Jasmine, as if the simple truth of what she had said had settled over her like a blanket. In the midst of the chaos, in the whirlwind of failure and fear, Jasmine had offered her something more valuable than a free meal, a sense of recognition, the understanding that she wasn't alone, that the struggle she faced wasn't hers to bear in isolation. The quiet power of that recognition was almost overwhelming. Tasha's hand slowly found its way to her heart. Emotion so subtle it was almost imperceptible, but it was as if she was holding on to the fragile moment that Jasmine had created between them. This wasn't just an act of kindness. It was a bond forged in the shared weight of their experiences. An acknowledgement that despite the world's indifference, they had both carried the same burdens. Jasmine didn't need the world to know her name. She didn't need accolades or applause. In this moment with Tasha and Malik, she had done something far more meaningful. She had seen them, truly seen them, and offered something that went beyond charity. She had given them dignity. As Tasha sat there, she felt the tension that had gripped her chest slowly begin to loosen. The world outside was still the same battles, the same struggles, but for just a moment she could breathe. And in that breath, she understood that sometimes kindness isn't about grand gestures or sweeping acts of heroism. Sometimes it's simply about sitting down, looking someone in the eye and saying, "I see you." Jasmine watched Tasha for a moment, noting the quiet tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes darted nervously to the side as if unsure how much to reveal. She had been through it all, the sting of rejection, the feeling of being invisible, and she could see the same battle lines etched across Tasha's face. For a brief second, the silence between them stretched out like an ocean, vast and filled with the unspoken weight of shared experience. Finally, Jasmine broke it, her voice gentle but steady, cutting through the heaviness. "What did you do before this?" she asked, her eyes soft but intent. Like she wasn't just asking about a job, but about the person Tasha had been before life had knocked her down. Tasha hesitated, her fingers toying with the edge of her napkin, the movements small and almost subconscious. Her lips parted to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She glanced at Malik, who was happily munching on his meal, unaware of the storm that had been raging just a few minutes ago. Jasmine waited, her presence unwavering, giving Tasha the space she needed without pressing. It was the kind of quiet support that spoke volumes, that didn't need to fill the air with noise, but simply let the truth emerge in its own time. Finally, Tasha looked up, her gaze meeting Jasmine's with a mixture of vulnerability and pride. "I used to work as an office assistant," she said softly, her voice tight with the memories of a life that felt so distant now. "I loved the work. I was good at it." Her words were steady, but there was a slight catch, a thin edge of emotion that betrayed the truth buried beneath. Jasmine nodded, sensing the undercurrent of pain in Tasha's voice. "What happened?" she asked, the question as much about the hardship she had faced as the story Tasha was about to tell. Tasha's eyes darkened slightly, the flicker of emotion quickly concealed by a practiced mask. "When the pandemic hit," she began, her voice quieter now, "they cut back on everything. I was one of the first to go. They told me it was temporary, that they would bring me back when things got better. But things never got better." She exhaled sharply, her gaze dropping to the table, as if the weight of the words was more than she could carry. "I've been looking for work ever since, but it's hard. When you're over 30, single, and have a kid, no one really wants to hire you, not when there's someone younger, someone without a kid. They tell you it's about experience, but you know deep down it's not about that. It's about who you are, who they think you are." Jasmine felt her jaw tighten, her grip on the table momentarily steadying herself. The unfairness of it was like a punch to the gut, the system rigged against people like Tasha, people like her. She didn't need to ask why. It was clear. The world hadn't just left Tasha behind. It had discarded her, and for no reason other than circumstances beyond her control. Jasmine leaned forward slightly, her voice a calm storm. That's a system failure, not a personal one, she said, her words firm with quiet fury. You shouldn't be struggling to prove your worth just because the world decided you didn't fit some mold. The fact that you're here, still fighting, still trying to make things work, that's what matters. Her gaze softened as she spoke, acknowledging the strength it took to keep moving in the face of such relentless hardship. Tasha looked up at Jasmine, her eyes raw with the unspoken weight of everything she had been through. She nodded slowly, her lips pressing together in a thin line, but there was something in her expression now. Something like relief mixed with the remnants of her own hard-won dignity. For a brief moment, it felt as though the world had shifted. Jasmine wasn't just a politician, a figurehead in the fight for justice. She was a human being who understood. And in that moment, that understanding meant everything. Jasmine's gaze softened as she sat back, the weight of the conversation still hanging in the air like a storm before the calm. There was an understanding between them now, a quiet recognition of the hardships they both carried. The bustling noise of the restaurant seemed to fade away, replaced by the faint rhythm of Tasha's heartbeat as she processed what had just transpired. Jasmine's words weren't just an offer, they were a lifeline. She could feel the years of struggle, the silent fights against a world that constantly overlooked her, rising up in a rush of emotion that she had long kept buried. For a moment, Jasmine simply watched her, allowing the silence to linger, knowing that the next words she spoke would be more than just an invitation, they would be a turning point. Finally, Jasmine reached into her pocket and pulled out a business card, its edges crisp and clean. She slid it across the table with a purpose, her hands steady, her eyes not leaving Tasha's face. "Come to my office tomorrow," she said, her voice calm but layered with an undeniable strength. "We're looking for someone like you, someone who's been through the fire and still stands, someone who knows what it means to keep going, even when everything else tells you to quit." The words settled into the space between them, and Tasha felt the weight of them as if they were something solid, something tangible. Jasmine's words weren't just a job offer. They were a recognition of the battle Tasha had fought alone for so long, a battle she hadn't expected anyone to see, let alone acknowledge. Tasha's hand hovered over the card for a moment, her fingers trembling as she reached for it. She hadn't known what to expect when she walked into this place, hadn't dared to imagine that the world might bend in her favor for once. But here it was, a sliver of possibility in her hand, something she hadn't even dared to wish for in her quietest moments. For the first time, she wasn't just a statistic, she was someone who could make a difference. Her eyes flickered to Malek, still enjoying his meal with that innocent smile of his, the smile that had stayed with her despite everything, the smile that reminded her of the promise she had made him, that she would give him a better life, that even in their darkest moments, she would find a way. Malik, blissfully unaware of the full weight of the conversation, looked up at his mother, his eyes searching hers with a quiet, steady gaze. He had been listening, even if he didn't understand the words. His gaze held a quiet confidence that sent a sharp ache through Tasha's chest, a mix of pride and sadness. He was looking at her with something she hadn't seen in so long: belief. For the first time in ages, he believed in her. He believed that they were worth more than the hand they had been dealt. Tasha's heart swelled with the unspoken promise that passed between them in that moment, a promise of hope, of redemption, of new beginnings. Tasha's fingers curled around the business card, and she held it in her palm as though it were a lifeline, the simplest but most significant thing she had held in years. She looked at Jasmine, at the woman sitting across from her, who had not only seen her, but had given her something: respect. It wasn't just the card or the promise of a job. It was the understanding, the acknowledgement that Tasha wasn't just a mother struggling to survive. She was worthy of standing tall, of fighting back. For the first time in what felt like forever, Tasha felt seen, truly seen. Not as a burden or an afterthought, but as someone with value, with strength. Tasha's gaze softened, and a lump formed in her throat, the tears threatening to spill. But she didn't let them fall. Not yet. She couldn't. Not with Malik sitting across from her, looking at her like she was a superhero. He believed in her, and for the first time, she believed in herself too. As the door to the restaurant swung open, a brisk wind swept inside, carrying with it the cool promise of the evening's end. The bright neon lights outside cast a soft glow on the pavement, and the night felt quieter somehow, as though the world outside was still catching its breath from the quiet storm that had passed within. Tasha took a deep breath, the weight of the day still heavy in her chest but tempered by something she hadn't expected: hope. Malik, oblivious to the complexity of the moments they had just lived through, skipped ahead, his small hands wrapped tightly around the little cake box Jasmine had given him. His smile was wide and unburdened, the kind of smile that only a child could wear when the world was at its darkest, and yet still able to find a reason to believe in joy. Tasha walked beside him, the steady rhythm of her footsteps matching the rising tide of thoughts in her head. She still couldn't entirely believe what had happened. Jasmine Crockett, the woman who had stood so firmly in front of millions, a voice of power and change, had simply sat with her, offered her respect, and given her something more than a free meal. It had been a moment of recognition, an acknowledgement that her struggle was seen, her resilience valued. Tasha had lived through so much, and yet she had always felt invisible, as though the world was too busy to notice how hard she fought to make things better for Malik. But in Jasmine's presence, she had felt something else, something she had almost forgotten existed: dignity. Jasmine had not just paid for their meal, she had given Tasha a sense of self-worth, something that had been beaten down by years of dismissal and rejection. As they reached the car, Tasha paused, her hand still on the door handle, her heart pounding with something that felt like a mix of gratitude and disbelief. She turned back, her eyes scanning the restaurant's door one last time, as if to ensure that this wasn't some fleeting dream, something she had imagined in the midst of her desperation. She saw Jasmine standing just inside, her figure a calm silhouette against the warm light. Her gaze was steady, not demanding anything in return, not expecting acknowledgement. Tasha's breath caught in her throat, and before she could stop herself, the words spilled out, thick with emotion. "Thank you," Tasha said, her voice barely above a whisper, the weight of her gratitude far too heavy for the simple words. But she couldn't help herself. "Thank you, not just for the meal." Her eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away quickly, her throat tightening as the reality of the moment finally settled into her bones. It wasn't the food that mattered, it wasn't the cake. It was the simple, profound kindness that Jasmine had shown, the kind of kindness that acknowledged Tasha not as a burden or an invisible person, but as someone worthy of care, respect, and an opportunity to rise. Tasha hadn't expected anything when she walked into that restaurant. She had expected to fight, to scrape by just to get through the day. But Jasmine had offered her something more. She had given her the sense that she didn't have to fight alone. Jasmine met her gaze from across the lot, and for a moment it felt as though the entire world held its breath. Then Jasmine's lips curled into a small, understanding smile. It wasn't a smile that sought praise or recognition. It was the smile of someone who had been there, who understood the depths of struggle, but also understood the power of small acts of defiance against a system that sought to break you. She took a step toward Tasha, her voice steady and calm, cutting through the night air. "You don't need a law to change your life," Jasmine said, her words soft but unyielding. "Sometimes all it takes is a cake and a chance." Her words hit Tasha like a wave crashing against the shore, sweeping away the last remnants of doubt that had clung to her. A chance. That was all she needed, all she had ever needed. The system had tried to push her down, to make her believe that she wasn't enough, that her struggles didn't matter. But in that single moment, Jasmine had offered her something the world had denied her for so long: a chance. Tasha could feel the heaviness in her chest beginning to lift, the burden of years of fighting alone starting to dissolve. For the first time, she saw a way forward, a path that didn't feel like an endless uphill battle. It was a path that included not just survival, but something more: hope. Jasmine's gaze softened as she saw Tasha's face, the raw emotion written clearly across it. There was no pity in Jasmine's expression, only a quiet understanding. She had been where Tasha was now, fighting for her place in a world that often didn't care. But in that moment, Jasmine didn't see a struggling mother. She saw a woman who had fought hard, who still had so much strength to give. And she knew that Tasha deserved more than just a moment of kindness. She deserved the chance to show the world what she was capable of. Tasha stood there for a moment longer, her heart racing with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. She looked down at Malik, still happily holding the cake box, his excitement never fading. He hadn't yet grasped the weight of the gesture, the significance of the chance that had been offered to them. But she did. And in that moment, as she looked at the world through her son's innocent eyes, she saw something else. Possibility. She wasn't just a woman trying to survive. She was a woman who had the power to change, to rise above the obstacles that had kept her down for so long. And it wasn't just because of a free meal. It was because someone had believed in her. As she turned to get in the car, Tasha took one last glance back at Jasmine. She saw the woman standing there, strong and unassuming, with a quiet resolve in her eyes. Jasmine had given her more than just a handout. She had given her a future. Tasha smiled through the tears, whispering under her breath, "Thank you. Thank you for giving me a chance." With Malik still bouncing in the back seat, she drove away, the world feeling just a little bit lighter, just a little bit more bearable. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she had more than just a fight ahead of her. She had a future, and she wasn't going to waste it. Jasmine stood there watching as Tasha and Malik made their way toward the door, their figures framed by the warm golden glow spilling from the restaurant's windows. The quiet clink of silverware and soft chatter from the other tables seemed to fade as she followed their movements with quiet intent. There was a subtle grace in the way they moved together, Tasha's posture still carrying the burden of her struggles. Yet there was something in her steps that now felt lighter. Malik skipped ahead, his small body a blur of energy, still holding his precious cake with the kind of joy that only a child could understand. Jasmine felt a stir in her chest, a quiet but steady pull that anchored her in the moment. She couldn't explain why she was so deeply affected by what she had witnessed. It wasn't just the act of giving them a meal, or even the cake. It was something deeper, something she had seen in Tasha's eyes. It was the spark of something long extinguished by the weight of unrelenting hardship, now flickering back to life. She saw it when Tasha had looked up at her, the faintest trace of hope breaking through the exhaustion, as if the offer of something more than just survival had finally cracked through the walls built by years of disappointment. And now, as mother and son stepped into the rain-soaked night, Jasmine felt an unspoken promise settle in the pit of her stomach. This could be the beginning of something different. The rain had started to fall in light, misty drops, as if the sky itself were shedding its own weight. The pavement outside the restaurant gleamed, its surface reflecting the neon lights of the sign above, the soft, colored glow blurring into the droplets that danced on the ground. It was such a simple scene. Mother and child walking through the rain, the world continuing to spin around them. But there was something about it that felt like a quiet rebellion against the injustice they had faced. Something small yet infinitely significant. Jasmine stood motionless for a moment, watching the two of them, her heart tightening with a mixture of hope and sorrow. The world outside was cold and indifferent, the streets slick with the remnants of a storm that had long passed. Yet in this fleeting moment, beneath the rain-soaked sky and the artificial lights, there was an undeniable warmth in the simple act of kindness that had unfolded. Jasmine watched as Tasha pulled her coat tighter around her body, her face lifted slightly as she walked. The slightest hint of something different in the way she carried herself now. It wasn't confidence. It was more than that. It was the beginning of something new, something they hadn't been able to imagine before. And Jasmine understood that. She understood what it felt like to be broken by the world and then given the chance to rebuild, to feel human again, to remember that there was still something worth fighting for. Tasha stopped for a moment at the edge of the sidewalk, and for the briefest of seconds, she turned back. Her eyes met Jasmine's, a silent exchange passing between them. There was no need for words. The acknowledgement in Tasha's gaze said it all. It was a moment of recognition. Tasha was no longer just a mother fighting to survive. She had been given something. She had been seen. In that moment, Jasmine knew she had done what she had set out to do, even if it was small. She had offered not just food, but a chance. And that chance, however fragile, was everything. Jasmine's breath caught as she watched Tasha and Malik step into the rain, the neon lights reflecting in the puddles, as if the whole world was holding its breath. The sound of the rain falling around them, combined with the soft echoes of their footsteps, created a rhythm that felt almost cinematic. An ordinary moment in a world that wasn't always kind, but a moment that held so much more than it seemed. Tasha and Malik, two souls who had been crushed by a system that didn't care, were now walking towards something new. It wasn't just survival, it was the promise of a future. And Jasmine, from her small corner of the world, knew she had done something that mattered. In that small, quiet moment, there was hope. As the door swung shut behind them, Jasmine turned back to the table, her mind still on the image of them walking into the rain-soaked night. It was a strange thing, this sense of connection, of knowing that something so simple could change everything. The injustice of Tasha's situation, the fact that she had to fight for something as basic as a chance, was still very much present. But Jasmine understood that change was a process, and that it began with one small act of kindness. This wasn't the end for Tasha, it was just the beginning. And Jasmine believed, with everything inside her, that this simple moment would ripple out into something far bigger. Sometimes all it takes is one person to see you, and when that happens, everything changes. Jasmine took one last look at the door, feeling the weight of the world pressed down on her shoulders, but for once it didn't feel so heavy. For once there was something else, something that had been absent for far too long. Hope. The rain outside had softened, the once fierce downpour now a gentle mist that clung to the earth like a whispered promise. Yet the storm inside Tasha's heart was still raging. She had walked into that restaurant defeated, almost resigned to the idea that the world had nothing more to offer her. The same world that had stripped her of dignity, had kept her invisible, and had made every effort to simply survive feel like an act of rebellion. But as she stood on the wet sidewalk, Malik's hand tightly clasped in hers, something had shifted. She felt something in the way she walked, in the way she breathed, in the way she now looked at the world with eyes that had been opened, if only for a moment. What had changed? The simple act of kindness from a stranger, from someone who had every reason not to help but chose to anyway? It wasn't just the free meal, or the cake that Malik held so tightly. Number it was something far deeper. It was the recognition, the acknowledgement that Tasha wasn't just another statistic, another woman abandoned by the system. She was a mother, she was a person, and for the first time in years, she felt like she mattered. But as they walked, Tasha's mind couldn't shake the truth that lay beneath the surface. Why had it taken someone like Jasmine, someone in power, someone with the resources to make a difference, to give her this small glimpse of humanity? Why had it taken someone outside the system, someone who could have easily turned a blind eye, to make her feel seen? The unfairness of it all clenched at her gut. Why should anyone have to fight for this? Why should anyone have to claw their way through life just to be heard, just to feel like they're worth more than the burden the world seems to place on their shoulders? The question burned inside her as she glanced at Malik, still unaware of the weight of the world she was carrying. He was smiling, his face bright with the innocence of a child who had never known hunger, never known the weight of not having enough. For a moment, she wished she could protect him from the harshness she had known. She wanted to give him the world, but all she had were these fleeting moments, these brief glimpses of hope, and she couldn't help but wonder how long they would last before the world turned cold again. And then it hit her. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This wasn't just about feeding her son or keeping a roof over their heads. This was about something bigger, something she hadn't allowed herself to think about in years. It was about change. The very thing that had been so elusive in her life was now in her hands. Fragile, yes, but it was there. The opportunity. She knew that nothing would be handed to her. She knew that she would have to fight, that she would have to claw her way through the next chapter of her life, just like she had through every other chapter. But for the first time, she understood that change was possible. Not because the system had finally decided to treat her fairly, but because sometimes you have to create the change. You have to become the change. The world, for all its cruelty, couldn't strip her of that power. No one could take that away from her. Not anymore. Jasmine's act of kindness had opened her eyes to the truth she had been ignoring for so long. It wasn't just about fighting the system. It was about standing up for what was right, for what she deserved. It was about demanding a future for Malik that was different from her own, a future where he would never have to fight as she did, where the weight of poverty would never hold him down. She wouldn't let him inherit the same world she had known. She wouldn't allow him to grow up in a world where his worth was measured by the contents of his wallet, the color of his skin, or the circumstances of his birth. As they walked on, the mist gently falling around them, Tasha felt something stir deep inside. It wasn't just anger or resentment for the system that had failed her. It wasn't even the faint flicker of hope that Jasmine had ignited in her. It was something much stronger: determination. She had been knocked down by life over and over again, but she wasn't done yet. This wasn't the end of her story. This was only the beginning. She glanced at Malik, his face still glowing with the joy of a child who had received a simple gift, and she knew deep in her soul that she would do whatever it took to protect that joy, to protect his innocence from a world that would try to grind him down, to rob him of his worth before he ever had the chance to see his full potential. It was then that she realized this was her fight, not just for herself, but for Malik, for every other person out there who had been told they weren't enough, who had been discarded by a system that claimed to care but showed its true face in moments like these. The world would not change overnight, and she couldn't do it alone. But in that quiet moment, walking into the mist, Tasha understood that she didn't need to do it alone. She had her son, and she had her own strength, and that was enough to make a difference. The world had always been unfair, had always been unkind. But Jasmine's simple act of kindness had sparked something in her, a flame that refused to be extinguished, a belief that, despite everything, change was possible. And maybe, just maybe, it started with something as small as a cake and a chance. But for Tasha, that moment had been more than just a chance. It had been the start of her own revolution, the start of her own fight for dignity, for respect, for a future that Malik deserved. And she would not stop until she saw it through. Tasha walked alongside Malik, her steps now deliberate, each one carrying more weight than before. The rain had softened into a mist, but the heaviness in her chest remained. She had been given a glimpse of something she never thought she would see. Someone had stepped in when the world had turned its back. Jasmine's simple act of kindness had sparked something deep inside her, something she hadn't felt in years. The feeling of being seen, not as a burden, not as an afterthought, but as someone who mattered. And that feeling was dangerous. Dangerous because it made her question everything she had accepted as normal. For so long she had fought alone, struggled against the world that seemed to have no place for her. But in that quiet moment, in that unexpected act of compassion, she had realized something. Change wouldn't come from waiting for someone else to fix things. It had to start with her. The injustice she had faced, the discrimination that had shaped her life, those things couldn't be ignored any longer. They couldn't be accepted as the norm. Her thoughts raced as she looked at Malik, still blissfully unaware of the deeper currents swirling around them. He was holding the small cake, his excitement pure and undiluted. But Tasha knew deep in her gut that his future wouldn't be as simple as this moment. The same system that had nearly crushed her would try to do the same to him. She wasn't going to let that happen. She had seen what could be done with a little kindness, a little recognition, and she wasn't about to let that flame of hope die out. Jasmine's words rang in her mind. Sometimes all it takes is a cake and a chance. She wasn't just talking about a meal or a birthday. She was talking about opportunity, about dignity, about the power of seeing someone for who they really are, and not just what they have or don't have. Tasha felt a surge of determination, a call to action that surged through her veins. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about fighting back. She wasn't going to let Malik grow up in a world that told him he was less than. She wasn't going to let him inherit the struggles she had faced. This was her fight now, not just for herself, but for him, for everyone who had been pushed to the margins. She wouldn't wait any longer for the world to change on its own. She would be the change, and she would take that first step forward, not knowing exactly where it would lead, but knowing one thing for sure. She wouldn't let fear stop her. The world could be unjust, but she would no longer be a bystander. The fight had begun. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.